This is the second part of our switch port analyzer chapter. We are going to talk about remote span. We are going to include what is remote span, why do we need remote span, the design rules for remote span, whether these features exist in remote span, filter VLAN, filter ACL, encapsulation replicate. We are going to see one configuration and one troubleshooting example. Let's talk first about what is RSpan. RSpan stands for Remote Switched Port Analyzer. It is going to allow us to monitor traffic on a certain source that live in one switch and send a copy of this monitored traffic to a destination that actually lives in another switch. This copy of this traffic is going to be transported through layer 2 trunks. So the main point of RSpan is that this process happens in different switches. So you may have different switches on your layer 2 deployment, and with RSpan the source live in one switch and the destination lives in another different switch. So in order to make this work, you will need trunks. So you will need a trunk here, a trunk here, and a trunk here. And then you need to create a particular VLAN that we are going to call the remote span VLAN, that you are going to create here, 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 and here. And you need to allow this VLAN in order to send traffic in this particular interface trunk, this interface trunk, this interface, and this interface. This means that you must make sure that this VLAN exists within the allowed VLAN list for these trunks, in such a way that the traffic will be copied and will be sent from source to destination. Now let's talk about why would we need remote span. With remote span, we are going to achieve the same objectives that we do with a traditional, normal, plain, vanilla span. We are going to be able to do telemetry, security, and troubleshooting. The only difference is that the device where we are going to send the copies of the traffic that you are monitoring exists in a remote switch, and the traffic is going to be transported through layer 2 trunks. So let's illustrate this with an example. Let's say that you have a server that is connected to your distribution layer, and you have that server connected there. It is always on. It is probably living at your MDF, and that will be your troubleshooting server. You will use it to troubleshoot issues. Let's say that one day you have an issue with a voice over IP device at this particular access switch. So in this case, you can create a remote span session. So you can actually create a copy of all the traffic that is going through this particular port and send it to your troubleshooting server that is connected in a different switch. Then you can actually examine the traffic. You can observe how the voice over IP protocols are working, see how if they are showing up some errors. So you can look after the root cause for this incident. And then maybe in another case, you have issues regarding an application that is connected to an end user device that is connected to a different port in a different access switch. And in that moment, you can also create a remote span session in order to create a copy of all the traffic that is going through that port and send it to your troubleshooting server, so you can do the same and figure out what is the root cause for this other incident. Actually, remote span makes more sense than traditional span, because usually your telemetry servers, your security devices, and your troubleshooting packet sniffers usually live in a different switch than the one where you are monitoring traffic. Okay, let's talk about some details about the remote span VLAN. You need a remote span VLAN in order to transport this copied traffic between source and destination. The remote span VLAN can only do its job through trunk interfaces. You need layer 2 trunk interfaces. This remote span VLAN must exist end-to-end between source and destination switches. So you must create this VLAN at every single switch between source and destination, including the source and destination switches. You must allow this VLAN at every single trunk interface. It must exist within the allowed VLAN list at every single trunk interface. And remember that this particular VLAN is not going to learn MAC addresses as any normal VLAN. Now let's talk about what particular features work with RSPAN. You can monitor transmission traffic, reception traffic, or both. So this feature works with RSPAN just as it works with regular span. You can use the filter VLAN feature. So the filter VLAN feature works with RSPAN just as it works with regular normal span. You can use the filter ACL feature with RSPAN just as it works with regular normal span. Remember that in this case, your remote span feature now is known as flow-based RSPAN or FRSPAN. Now, the encapsulation replicate feature does not work with RSPAN, so you are not able to receive or to know what was the original tag for your frames that you're monitoring. So you are not going to receive that. You are not going to receive layer 2 control frames on the traffic that you are monitoring. Bear that in mind. Next, let's talk about how to configure remote span. Remember that you must create the remote span VLAN from end to end. Let's say in this example that the remote span VLAN is number 6. So we are going to use this command VLAN 6 as any other VLAN. The only difference is that within VLAN configuration mode, we are going to enter this command remote span. So we are defining this particular VLAN to be a remote span VLAN. And then we have to make sure that at every single trunk from source to destination, we have to add this VLAN to the allowed VLAN list. So we will use the switchport trunk allowed VLAN add command. And then we can configure the monitor session. Remember that the number is actually not transmit over the wire, so this number has local scope. You can configure one number at one switch and a different number in another switch. This is just to show that, but the best practice is to actually use the same number to identify the same session, because now we are configuring different switches, but you can use different numbers if you want. Now in the source switch, you are going to configure the source as usual, but the destination changes. Now the destination is the remote span VLAN. And at the destination switch, you are going to configure the source as the remote span VLAN, and the destination is actually the destination port where you want to send the copy of the traffic to. Now let's talk about how to troubleshoot remote span. Probably the most important command will be show monitor session. In this case, this is the output for the switch where the source lives. So you will see that the type indicates remote source session. In this case, we are monitoring VLANs, particularly VLAN number 2, for both reception and transmission of traffic. For the source switch, the copy of all of this traffic that is being monitored is being sent to the remote span VLAN that happens to be VLAN number 6. Now this will be the output for the switch where the destination lives. In this case, the show monitor session will tell you that the type is remote destination session. In this case, the source of the traffic comes from the remote span VLAN that is number 6. and we are going to send all this traffic to the destination ports gigabit 00 and gigabit 02. In this case, we have enabled encapsulation replicate. We can do so, however, we know that this does not work with remote span. Other commands that you could use could be, for instance, show VLAN ID 6 at every single switch from source to destination to know whether you have created successfully VLAN 6, which is the remote span VLAN. And you could use also show interface trunk to make sure that this VLAN is being forwarded through your trunk interfaces. This is a summary of what we saw in this chapter. We defined what is remote span. Why do we need it? We talk about how remote span is actually more useful than regular normal span. We talk about the design rules, mainly related to the remote span VLAN. And we talk about what features do we have available when using remote span. We have filter VLAN, we have filter ACL that turns remote span into flow-based remote span. We saw that the encapsulation replicate feature does not work with remote span. We saw one configuration example, and we saw the troubleshooting commands, for instance, show monitor session, show interface trunk, and show VLAN ID.